Walter Green's mornings had a rhythm: black coffee, the local paper, and a slow walk beneath the towering oak his grandfather planted nearly a century ago. The cool Vermont air drifted through the cracked window above the kitchen sink. Walter, in his worn flannel robe, reached for the percolator. The familiar hiss and bubble filled the kitchen as he unfolded the Maple Hollow Gazette and set it next to his mug. Outside, the early October light filtered through amber leaves, casting dancing shadows on the wooden floor. On the radio, AM 760 hummed softly, broadcasting the daily weather and a reminder about the upcoming Harvest Festival. Walter nodded along to the voice, already picturing the town square with booths of apple cider, homemade quilts, and school kids in paper scarecrow hats. That morning, the tree felt unusually still, as if it too sensed its time was running short. Walter stepped out onto his porch, cradling his mug in both hands. The oak stood tall and silent, its trunk thick with time, branches heavy with age and history. He shuffled across the lawn, bent slightly to touch the metal plaque near its roots. Designated Heritage Oak, 1974. A layer of dew coated the inscription. He wiped it with his sleeve. The tree had stood through storms, droughts, and 3 generations of greens. It was more than a landmark. It was memory made real. As he turned back toward the house, a familiar voice called from across the hedgerow. "Morning, Walter." Sally Monroe waved with one flour-dusted hand, the other balancing a foil-covered plate. Walter met her at the picket gate. "You've been baking," he smiled, already knowing the answer. "I'm always baking this time of year. Can't have a festival without Monroe's apple pie. Made extra for you." She handed him the plate, warm through the foil. "But that's not why I stopped by." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "You hear about the HOA's new inspection list?" she asked, lowering her voice. Walter blinked. "Inspection? For what?" Sally glanced at the oak. "They're going around tagging trees. Something about uniformity before the festival. Karen's behind it, of course. Wants everything tidy for the town visitors." He scoffed. "They wouldn't dare touch this one. It's protected. Been since the 70s. I've got the original plaque to prove it." "Don't shoot the messenger," Sally said. "Just figured you should know what's brewing." Walter thanked her for the pie and the heads up, and watched her shuffle back to her porch, apron fluttering in the breeze. He looked at the oak again, a little longer this time. Its branches creaked faintly. Maybe just the wind, maybe something more. The rest of the day passed as it usually did. Walter walked into town for groceries, waved to familiar faces, and admired the paper pumpkins already strung up around the post office. Maple Hollow was that kind of town, small, steady, polite. On his way home, the evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and a chill crept into the air. That's when he saw it. A strip of neon pink fabric tied around one of the lower branches of the oak. It fluttered lazily in the breeze, bright and foreign against the bark. Walter stopped in his tracks. For a long moment, he just stared. No note, no explanation, just the ribbon. He walked slowly to the tree, jaw tight. He reached up, tugged gently on the ribbon. It was knotted tight. Not a child's prank. Not random. Someone had marked his tree. Marked it without asking. Inside, he pulled open an old drawer in the roll-top desk and found the envelope stamped Pine Hollow HOA. He took out a blank sheet of letterhead and began to write. His pen scratched against the paper with deliberate pressure. "To whom it may concern, this morning, I discovered a marking placed on my heritage oak tree without prior notice." He wrote calmly but firmly. He folded the letter with care, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. Stepping out into the cold night, he slipped it into the old metal mailbox by the road, its red flag raised like a quiet warning. Walter stood on his porch, staring at the ribbon fluttering in the wind, uneasy but trusting the system. The next morning, he's jolted awake by the distant grind of chainsaws, coming from his own front yard. By the time Walter stepped onto his porch in slippers and robe, the once majestic oak was already gone, limbs shredded, trunk sawed, roots torn. The sound of chainsaws had already died down, replaced by the low rumble of diesel engines and the clanking of metal as the crew packed up their tools. The smell of fresh cut wood hung in the air, sickeningly sweet. Walter stood there, unmoving, mouth parted but silent. His yard, once shaded by a canopy of rustling amber leaves, was now a barren patch of torn soil and scattered sawdust. Beside the fresh stump, caked in mud, lay the tarnished brass plaque, kicked aside, unread. He walked slowly across the grass, the cold dampness soaking through his slippers. The plaque glinted faintly in the gray morning light. He crouched with difficulty and picked it up, brushing off the dirt with the cuff of his robe. His fingers trembled as he turned it over in his hands. Designated Heritage Oak, 1974. The lettering was still there, still proud, but its place beneath the tree was gone. Walter turned to the workers, one of whom was stepping into a white pickup truck with a logo for Greenpoint Landscape and Removal. He raised his voice, not in anger but desperation. "Who gave you permission to do this?" The man paused, clearly uncomfortable. He was in his 40s, with calloused hands and a worn cap. "Sir, we were hired by the HOA. We were just following the work order." Walter took a few steps closer, holding up the plaque. "This tree was federally protected. Did you even check?" The crew leader sighed and reached into his clipboard, pulling out a printed sheet. "All I can tell you is, this came from the HOA president's office. Signed and stamped. Said it had to be done before the festival setup." Walter took the paper, eyes scanning the bold header, Community Compliance Action, Tree Removal Authorization. At the bottom, in looping script, was the signature, Karen Whitmore, President, Pine Hollow HOA. There was no mention of a permit number, no government seal, just a stamped HOA logo and language about visual standards. He didn't say another word. He turned, walked inside, and closed the door softly behind him. In the kitchen, he placed the plaque gently on the counter, next to his half-empty coffee mug from the morning before. The contrast between metal and ceramic felt symbolic. Old and new, legacy and routine, both now broken. Later that morning, he changed into proper clothes, corduroy pants and a button-down flannel, and drove to the HOA office on Maple Lane. The building was modern and sterile, all glass panels and sharp edges. Inside, the air smelled faintly of printer toner and eucalyptus. A receptionist sat behind the desk, eyes fixed on her screen. Walter approached calmly. "I'd like to speak with the president of the HOA. It's about a demolition that occurred on my property." The woman looked up briefly, tapped a few keys, and said without inflection, "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Walter said, "but this can't wait." From the hallway behind her, heels clicked on tile. A woman appeared, dressed in a cream blazer and black slacks. Blonde bob, flawless makeup, posture like a statue. "That would be me," she said, stepping forward. "Karen Whitmore, HOA president. You must be Mr. Green." Walter squared his shoulders. "You demolished a federally protected tree on my property without a permit." Karen gave a small, rehearsed smile. "We sent multiple notices, Mr. Green. The tree was deemed a visual obstruction and a safety concern. I received nothing. No letters. No calls. No in-person visit. And the tree wasn't just any tree. It was listed on the National Registry." Karen raised a brow, unimpressed. "Our compliance officers marked it last week. You had ample time to respond." "Marked it?" he asked, voice rising. "With a ribbon tied at dusk?" She turned slightly, as if bored. "All community members signed documentation agreeing to maintain property aesthetics. Section 4. Paragraph 6 states the HOA reserves the right to act in cases of noncompliance." "I want to see the documentation," Walter said. "The notices you claim were sent. The safety inspection reports. The city permits." Karen's smile vanished. "That's internal HOA business. Members only." Walter stared at her, disbelief slowly turning to something harder. She smoothed the sleeve of her blazer. "Maybe it's time your yard matched the rest of the community, Mr. Green." He stood there, stunned, as she turned and walked away down the hall. The receptionist didn't look up again. Back in his truck, Walter's hands gripped the steering wheel for a full minute before he exhaled. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a familiar name. "Martha," he said when she picked up. "Dad? What's wrong?" "They cut down the tree." "My tree. The oak." There was a pause on the line. "The one with the heritage plaque." "That's the one. HOA says it was unsafe. No permit. No notice. Just gone." He could hear her breathing shift gears, from concern to focus. "That tree was on the National Registry of Heritage Trees. I'm coming home." When Martha Green arrived at Maple Hollow, the town square smelled like cider and cinnamon, but her purpose wasn't sweet. The crisp air carried the kind of charm that tourists romanticized. Banners announcing the Harvest Festival, kids darting past stacks of hay bales, and the comforting aroma of baked apples wafting from Sally Monroe's bakery booth. But Martha wasn't here for nostalgia. Her boots clicked briskly against the cobblestones as she crossed the square with a leather satchel over her shoulder, her breath puffing in short clouds. As a child, she once buried a time capsule beneath the oak. Now, all that remained was dirt and silence. Walter met her at the front door with a weak smile. He looked tired but steadier than he had the day before. "Coffee's on," he said. "You must have left at dawn." "I did," she replied, stepping inside and hanging her coat. Didn't want to waste a minute. His house smelled like cedar and old books. A plate with crumbs sat in the sink, leftover pie. The brass plaque lay on the kitchen table, polished and still slightly bent. She picked it up, ran her thumb along the edge. "They kicked it aside like garbage," he said quietly. "They made it personal," she replied, eyes narrowing. By mid-morning, Martha was at the town hall, tucked beneath the painted cornices of the historical building that once served as a train depot. The clerk behind the desk wore bifocals and a cardigan with little pumpkins stitched into the sleeves. "You're Walter's girl," she said, flipping through a ledger. "He brought you to the harvest parade when you were, what, 8? "Sounds about right," Martha smiled. "I'm hoping you can help me find some documentation on the oak tree at 612 Hickory Lane. It was registered decades ago." The clerk's eyes lit with recognition. "That old thing? I remember the day your granddad came in with the paperwork. Big ceremony. They even printed it in the Gazette." Within minutes, Martha was flipping through yellowed folders, the paper brittle with age. She found it, an official certificate signed by a now-retired state forester. National Registry of Heritage Trees. Entry hashtag VMD 034, issued August 12, 1974. She made copies, filed them neatly, and took a breath. It was a good start. Back at her father's kitchen, she laid out the documents like puzzle pieces. No permits, no compliance orders. "They just did it," she muttered, highlighting sections. Walter watched from the table, hands wrapped around his mug. "They claimed they sent notices." She shook her head. Even if they had no authority to override federal protection without a hearing, a vote, and a filed removal permit. Before dinner, they walked to Maple Diner, just a few blocks from the square. It hadn't changed since Martha was in high school. Red booths, a counter lined with chrome stools, and coffee that came hot and endless. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped in. Elliot Tran was already seated at a booth near the window, nervously stirring sugar into his cup. He was in his early 40s, button down slightly wrinkled, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. When he saw Martha, he stood awkwardly and offered his hand. "Ms. Green," he said, "thank you for meeting me. Call me Martha. This is my father, Walter." They sat, and Elliot got right to it. "I didn't vote for the tree removal," he began. Karen called an emergency session, just her and 2 others. It wasn't a full board vote. Martha leaned forward. "Did she do that often?" He nodded slowly. "Too often. She pushes things through, calls it executive privilege. And people let her because, well, she's persuasive." "You mean intimidating," Walter added. Elliot didn't disagree. Martha jotted notes while Elliot continued. "There's more. She's been trying to revise landscape rules for months. It's not just about trees. There's a pattern." After Elliot left, promising to keep things quiet, Martha and Walter lingered over their coffee. A waitress dropped a certified envelope on the table. This came by courier, addressed to Mr. Green. Walter opened it, frowning. The letter inside bore the HOA's seal. It claimed his yard was now non-compliant due to the exposed stump and threatened daily fines unless corrective action was taken. Martha snorted. "They destroy your tree, then fine you for the aftermath." She held the plaque in one hand and the HOA letter in the other. "They're not just wrong, they're vulnerable." Elliot slipped her a manila envelope under the diner table. "You didn't get this from me, but it'll help." Every folding chair in the Maple Hollow Community Center was filled. People came for a routine HOA meeting, but sensed something bigger was about to happen. The room buzzed with a low hum, not unlike the anticipation before a town parade. Paper leaves from last week's fall craft fair still hung above the stage, and the scent of stale coffee drifted from the corner urn. Walter stood near the back wall, hands in his pockets, scanning the crowd. Familiar faces dotted the rows. Mrs. Carmichael from Hickory Lane, the Thompsons who always decorated too early for Halloween, And of course, Sally Monroe, sitting front and center with a determined expression and her knitting needles at rest in her lap. Walter looked out across the room and remembered town gatherings from years past. Potlucks, tree lightings, not legal showdowns. Martha stood just off stage, a slim manila folder tucked under one arm. She wore a gray cardigan over a pressed blouse, her expression steady. Elliot Tran lingered nearby, fidgeting with his cuff buttons. Karen Whitmore hadn't emerged yet, but the stirrings near the office door suggested her arrival was imminent. At precisely 6 o'clock, the double doors opened and Karen swept in, clipboard in hand. She walked with the precision of someone used to control. Behind her, 2 board members trailed silently. She took the mic, tapped it once, and launched into the evening's agenda without preamble. "Let's keep this meeting brief," she said, her voice cool. "We have updates on landscaping regulations and a vote scheduled for budget allocation." Martha stepped forward. "Madam Chair, I have a request to address the board." Karen glanced at her, eyes narrowing. "We're following agenda order tonight." Walter's voice cut through the air from the back. "Let her speak." Karen's lips tightened, but the murmurs around the room had already begun. With a forced smile, she nodded. "Very well. 5 minutes." Martha stepped up to the front, placing the manila folder on the podium. She opened it with care and pulled out a photocopy of the federal designation certificate. "This document," she began, "is a 1974 federal registration certifying the oak tree at 612 Hickory Lane as a heritage tree, protected under state and federal guidelines." She held up another page. "And this is a confirmation from the Vermont Department of Environmental Protection that no permit was ever filed for its removal." A few gasps rippled through the audience. Karen crossed her arms. "That tree was unsafe," she said flatly. "We acted under emergency authority." Martha nodded. "Emergency actions require a majority board vote under HOA bylaws. According to the board records," she said, lifting another page, "only 3 members were present. The minimum is 5. Karen's smile faltered. "Furthermore," Martha continued, "I have printed copies of emails, provided anonymously, where the president instructed the removal crew to complete the job before any complaints could be filed." The room fell silent. Karen opened her mouth, but Elliot stood. "I was left out of that vote," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "So were 2 other board members." He turned to the audience. This wasn't emergency action. This was a decision made behind closed doors. People began to stir. Mrs. Patel raised her hand, trembling slightly. "She fined me $300 for having marigolds in my yard," she said. "Called them invasive." A man near the back chimed in. "She made me repaint my shutters twice because the shade of blue wasn't calming enough." Sally stood, knitting clutched tightly. "She threatened to revoke my festival booth if I didn't remove my sign honoring veterans." Voices grew louder, not in chaos but in shared realization. One by one, neighbors rose with stories of fines, warnings, and silent pressure. Karen remained at the front, motionless. Walter walked slowly up the aisle, stopping beside Martha. In one hand, he held the brass plaque, in the other, a framed photo. He placed the photo on the table in front of Karen, a black and white image of a man standing proudly beside a young sapling, arm draped around a boy who looked strikingly like Walter. "That's my father," Walter said, voice steady. "And me, age 6. That tree grew with us. Through wars, funerals, weddings, and every Sunday morning I've spent reading the paper beneath it." He looked directly at her. "Karen, you didn't just cut down a tree. You cut through history." The room stilled, not out of fear but reverence. Then a voice rose from the back. It was a man in a worn blazer, notebook in hand. "The State Environmental Office will want a statement on this. I've already sent them your file." The morning after the meeting, the air in Maple Hollow felt different, less like fall, more like a thaw. The sun rose gently over the town, casting a golden hue on porches and sidewalks still damp with dew. For once, there was no lingering tension in the breeze, no hum of rumor or waiting judgment. It was just quiet, like the town itself had exhaled. Walter stood in the kitchen, flipping the switch on the old drip machine. He reached up to the shelf and pulled down 2 mugs, his usual chipped one, and the taller ceramic with a small pinecone printed on the side. He filled them both, placing the pinecone mug to the left of the Gazette, like it had always belonged there. Martha came in barefoot, hair still a little tousled. She smiled when she saw the mug. I forgot you still had that. He grinned. Some things are worth keeping. They drank in silence for a moment, until a knock came at the front door. Walter opened it to find a uniformed courier holding a cream envelope marked State of Vermont, Environmental Division. Martha opened it slowly, eyes scanning. They reviewed the removal and confirmed it was a violation. A formal fine is being issued to the HOA, she said. Karen's name is specifically listed as the authorizing official. Walter sat down. So it's official now, not just words in a town hall. Later that morning, the HOA held a special meeting, this time announced to all residents. The community center wasn't as full as it had been the night before, but those who came brought quiet intensity. Elliot Tran, now acting as interim president, stood at the front with the full board. Karen wasn't there. Elliot explained the vote had been taken. Karen Whitmore was suspended indefinitely, pending a formal ethics review. He acknowledged the need for reform and proposed the formation of a transparency committee to revise HOA policies, especially those concerning property rights. Back on Hickory Lane, Walter walked across his now silent yard. The stump had been ground down, the earth smoothed over. Where the roots once reached, a few children chased each other, laughter echoing where the old shade used to fall. It wasn't bitter, it was bittersweet. He sat on the porch steps, watching them. Sally Monroe came by, holding a casserole dish covered in foil. I don't know what I'm more relieved about, she said, handing it to him. Karen stepping down or my begonias no longer being a crime. He laughed quietly. Both seem overdue. Martha spent the afternoon at town hall with Elliot, reviewing draft policies. Together, they outlined a new HOA charter that would require documented transparency for all decisions affecting private property. The proposed amendments included open forums, published vote records, and a clause requiring homeowner notification before any action could be taken. The paper ran a headline the next morning: Maple Hollow takes root in reform. A photo showed Walter and Martha standing beside a table of signatures and policy drafts. On October 10th, Walter passed by the HOA office on his way to the post office. Through the window, he saw Karen alone, quietly boxing books and framed certificates into a cardboard box. She didn't look up. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. That evening, a knock came at the greenhouse. It was Brian Doyle, one of the town council members. We'd like you to speak at the Harvest Festival, he said. About the tree, about what it meant. And if you'd be willing, maybe help us plant something new. Walter nodded slowly. It won't replace what was lost, he said. But maybe it can remind us not to forget. As he and Martha shared one last cup of tea that night, her phone buzzed on the table. She checked the screen, eyebrows lifting slightly. Boston Globe, she said, showing the caller ID. She answered. Ms. Green, came a woman's voice. Maple Hollow is trending. People want to know how you stood up to your HOA. On the morning of the Harvest Festival, Walter pinned a red ribbon to his flannel shirt and stepped out to greet a crowd, not as a victim, but as a host. The square pulsed with life, as it always did this time of year. Tables lined the brick paths, stacked with pumpkin pies, jars of pickled vegetables, maple candies, and hand-sewn quilts fluttering in the breeze. Orange and gold leaves tumbled from the trees above, drifting lazily across booth awnings and sticking to jackets and scarves. Children weaved between hay bales and scarecrow displays, laughing as they clutched caramel apples or cups of warm cider. Near the park center, a wooden stake marked where the new sapling would go, just beside the original roots. Walter walked slowly through the crowd, stopping to shake hands and accept soft pats on the shoulder. People didn't offer condolences. They offered stories. One woman recalled reading to her son beneath the oak while he battled illness. Another remembered her proposal there, a chilly autumn night in '86. Sally Monroe was manning a table of baked goods, her apron already smudged with flour. You ready? She asked, sliding a small tin of cinnamon rolls into his hands. Walter nodded. Feels right. At noon, a bell rang out from the gazebo stage. Martha stepped forward to introduce the ceremony. She kept it brief, her tone formal but warm. Today, she said, we're not just planting a tree. We're reaffirming what this town values, its history, its people, and the spaces that hold our memories. Walter stepped up next. He wasn't one for speeches, and everyone knew that, but they quieted for him all the same. My father planted that oak not for beauty, he said, but for shade and for roots. Roots that held more than soil. They held birthdays and bike lessons, Sunday mornings, and quiet talks. When it was cut down, we lost something bigger than branches. But you all stood with me. And now, we plant not to replace, but to remember. The young sugar maple stood upright in the cleared plot, its thin trunk supported by wooden stakes, its roots cushioned with a blend of soil, some freshly tilled, and some preserved from the original oak. As Walter and Martha knelt to spread the earth, a hush fell. Then, the first ribbon was tied. Children lined up with bits of colored fabric, reds, blues, yellows, tying them gently to the lower limbs. Sally stepped forward, holding a framed black and white photo. She handed it to Walter. "I found this in an old festival scrapbook," she said. "Me, maybe 6 years old, sitting under the oak." He took it, eyes misting. That tree gave so many of us a place to grow. Nearby, Elliot Tran helped guide the crowd into a semicircle around the sapling. No podiums, no microphones, just neighbors standing close. Later in the afternoon, as music played softly from a string quartet and cider simmered in big metal pots, Martha stepped away to check her phone. She scanned an email and smiled. "The Maple Hollow resolution," she said to Walter, "is being cited in 3 different counties. Other towns are looking into reforming their HOA charters." Walter chuckled, all because of one stubborn tree. As the light waned and the festival began to thin, Walter walked alone to the sapling. He held the brass plaque in his hand, polished to a soft gleam. He knelt, secured it to a wooden post beside the tree. The plaque didn't just mark the spot. It marked what had been lost, and what had now taken root. As the sun sets over Maple Hollow, Walter whispers, "Let's see if you'll last another 100 years." On a crisp autumn morning, a small town gathered not to mourn what was lost, but to honor what still held them together. Beneath golden leaves and warm cider, neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, roots intertwined not just in soil, but in shared memory. What began as the fall of a tree became the rise of a community that chose truth over silence and legacy over convenience. When good people stand firm, quietly, steadily, no policy can outlast their roots. Some trees grow tall, others grow deep, and sometimes the strongest grow back.